So the idea is that I'm trying to get this to look a little bit like a PS1 game. I've been going over this idea for ages about trying to emulate PS1 graphics since I started doing 3D work. I just have a fascination with like retro style graphics, and that's why I showed off this PlayStation shader that I'd actually found online and recreated, which gave me this really kind of pixelated look on everything, which was really cool. But I wanted to keep sort of the dynamic shadows, so it wasn't totally like 100% PS1 looking, but looked just slightly better.
So what you actually see here with the arch zooming in, all the lines, all the vertical lines also, they zoom in, they jump around. What is supposed to be a straight line just jumps around. The blue is actually very visible, and the lines on the road also, they jump around quite a bit. It's just not a very clean looking experience. It's one of the nicest and the best looking games out there. Oh, here you can actually see that quite a bit. You can actually see the darker bit of the wall. You can actually see the sine waves occurring.
Dithering on the PS1 is a much more complex topic. Call it charm or call it annoyance, the PlayStation applies dynamic dithering at the discretion of the developer, sometimes blanketing everything with a checkerboard dithering pattern at the time the graphics are rendered. This leaves two big questions. Number one, why is dithering necessary on a 32-bit console? And number two, what are you talking about? I don't see any dithering in PS1 games. Let's examine dithering on the Sony PlayStation, as well as find out why it seems to be extinct in the modern era. The PlayStation GPU has two modes in regard to color depth. One of these is a 24-bit direct mode that allows for 16.7 million colors, but is essentially used for still image display. We need to do a lot more than that. The second is a 15-bit direct mode. This drops our total on-screen maximum color count to 32,768, when totaling the colors of all the polygons, map textures, and shading on the screen at the same time will never surpass this total. There are additional details to mention for development and colors on the PlayStation in regard to this restriction, but let's move past the system programming and focus more on the results we see as gamers. I'll simulate some PlayStation-esque dithering in Photoshop. We'll start with a smooth gradient. Now let's drop the image to only 16 colors. Notice the banding. The transition from left to right is jarring as we move from one color to another. Now let's perform the same conversion but apply a dithering pattern. It still only consists of 16 colors, but the use of dithering makes the transition from one color to another much smoother. Dithering such as this is applied dynamically and ad nauseum on the PS1 in order to compensate for lack of color depth, not just to gradients, but also to textured polygons and even 2D pixel art at times. The results will vary depending on the surface receiving the dithering. So why does it seem like you don't see it as prominently with PS1 games these days? Well, there are several reasons. Emulators can simply ignore the color restrictions of the original hardware and render in 32-bit color. PS1 games on the PS3 are upscaled with a degree of smoothing regardless of your smooth setting on the system, and therefore present dithering that is less prominent. Online video footage of PS1 games often consists of a low-resolution capture, or is highly compressed, therefore hiding the dithering details in an unnatural way. Contrast the modern machine solutions with those individuals that elect to use original hardware, such as a PS1 or a PS2 paired with RGB cables. This approach most definitely allows for the dithering pattern to be seen. The irony, of course, is that there are several that take this approach and state that they don't like the dithering and would prefer it not be present.
So even though I do have the full copies of games like Gran Turismo, like Ridge Racer and stuff, what I wanted to do was look around the menus and kind of get a feel for what I would need menu-wise before actually going ahead and just trying the games out on the demo discs. I just found it a little bit easier to just grab a demo disc and slap it in, and then if I needed to, jump out again. Because these are vertical slices of the games, it made it a lot easier for me to just jump in, have a look at stuff, and then jump out again. So with things like Gran Turismo, there's a lot of polish on the cars, on the levels. We can see stuff here, like they have reflections on the vehicles. This is like really basic cube map stuff that's really low res, but it still sells the idea of the machines themselves being reflective or having reflective properties. I really liked that, and I wanted to take a little bit of inspiration from that and also see what else Gran Turismo did. So when looking at Gran Turismo, it uses a lot of like alpha maps for different things like signage, for the supports that are on the side here in the Clubman stage. You can see the reflections on the vehicle itself. It's still kind of blocky graphics, but the way that it looks is real nice. It's one of the better looking games on the original PlayStation. The signs here are just flat planes. The shadows underneath, I don't know whether those are actual real-time or whether those are models that they've just slapped on. I love the way they do the lighting with this stage as well. It's fantastic. We get some like glow on the real lights when we're braking. But overall, it's a really polished visual, and this is something that I really wanted to go over, was something that looked really fantastic and looked like it had shaders, obviously with PlayStation 1 graphics. Next up here was Rainbow Six. I didn't actually realize I had a demo disc with this on, and I couldn't remember it from the original PlayStation, but it's kind of what I was going for in terms of graphics, a very close quarters environment where you're interacting with objects and watching out for enemies. The enemy animations are kind of a little bit jank. I think it's because of the fact that there aren't many frames to them. They just kind of fall and there only seems to be like a couple of frames. But we can see the affine texture warping in first person. We can see how detailed the environment is. There's some animated stuff like the ceiling fans. It's very simple textures, but it definitely gives you good visuals for what it is. There's very low-res models for I think it's this MP5 that I'm holding. As you can see here, we're just going through and trying to clear this place out, and also just trying to get that texture reference as an idea visually of how this is going to look when I try and do something myself. We've got an image intensifier here, which helps out a little bit, see in the dark. But it's very simple UIs. Like with the reloading, it conveys it really easily with the magazine reload part of the UI, so you know exactly what's going on, how long it will take. The only problem with this demo is that it was on time limit, so I kind of had to play it a couple of times to get used to it, and then go run through it as fast as I could and try getting my reference at the same time, not looking like I absolutely suck at the demo. Now, I do like the way that this looks. It's very close to what I want to do in terms of developing an environment that looks really nice and low poly, and it doesn't look too bad. I really like this demo. It's really fun. And no trip to the PlayStation can be complete without a Tomb Raider game, so I had to go and look at one of the first games I ever played on it originally, which was Tomb Raider 2. On this, it looks a little bit more pixelated. We've got some seams in the models here and there, which I think I can emulate that, but I like how low poly this is and the way that it's done. I did mess up a couple of times going back to it, but we can still see the texture warping, the low poly models that are mainly made out of old boxes and just done really creatively to give them different shapes for the characters and other things. So this is an interesting one. This is Life Force Tenka from the original PlayStation 1 demo that you get with the console. And this is something that was developed by Psygnosis. and it's really good in terms of visuals as a first-person shoot 'em up that they made really early on in the PlayStation 1's lifespan. It's got a lot of cool effects. It's got what I think is dynamic lights, or very basic looking dynamic lights on like the effects for the guns and stuff. The terrain is similar to what I'm going for in terms of affine texture warping in first person. You don't get to see it too much, but if you get up to like one of the walls incredibly close, you start to see the textures warping here and there. It's got a lot of cool visuals in terms of the effects, the lighting, the way the levels are laid out, and just everything in general meshes together to look like this really nice, polished game. And this was good for inspiration, just for kind of getting an idea of what things could be like if or when it's all done. You know, as a just a base idea to what I'm going for. Again, here's another one of the very first games where I played. This is Test Drive 4 on the PlayStation. Like Gran Turismo, this does another way of simulating reflections, or at least faking them on the rear screen here of the car. It's funny because when things get in the distance, they look like they're floating because they don't render the tires, but this is kind of a low-res driving game. Everything's coming up real fast. It looks like we've got alpha maps for the lights on the side of the road. It's a very awkward game as well in terms of how difficult it is. You can't get through one level without getting smashed into, I think, or at least I didn't here. You can see a little bit of texture stretching there, which, when it comes to the final game, I don't know whether I should throw in some texture stretching deliberately to kind of give it that old feel. Normally with texture maps and things like that, I'm really careful in making sure that everything looks good, but on the original PlayStation games, it seems like it was done almost deliberately, or rather the devs didn't notice it in some areas. We got some alpha maps on the foliage there, but overall it's a nice looking visual. I really do like it. There's a lot of pixelated UI elements that I'm going to have to try and recreate when I do my game. I really do like this. It's a fun game, but it's hard. So here we're looking at Siphon Filter. This was mainly when I was doing research into character models, because of the models being all one thing, not sort of different bits of geometry that were animated separately. Like in some games, the early Tekkens, and with Resident Evil, I was planning on just making them very similar to this, because it's just one model connected, so the rig looks really nice and smooth. But I ended up eventually going for the Resi style, just because it was a little bit easier to do for me, and it looked a little bit better in terms of the style, you know, making it look older with the geometry kind of being floating. I've always had that kind of fascination with that look for characters, very similar to like Virtua Fighter on the Saturn, where that has like very, very basic blocky characters. I do like that style, so I thought I'd go with that. But this is another game that has a really cool look to it, has a lot of small interactables that look nice, and overall it's a really fun action game, but it as well has texture warping, as you can see at the sides where the walls are. When we're moving around as Gabe here, you can see the textures slowly warping on the walls as we go past in the corner of the camera, and the ceiling and the floor does it as well when you step into areas that have like checkered textures. So we've got that emulated pretty well. So after doing a lot of research, thanks to the previous videos and looking around at different games, here we've got the post-processing effects in Unreal, and what we have here is some low-resolution post-processing to get all the jaggies here. We've got a little bit of sharpening on some of the edges, and we've also got dithering. And combined, this gives us a pretty convincing look. As you can see up in the sky, a lot of it is now affected by the dithering and the low resolution, making everything look a little bit more pixelated. But we don't seem to have that sort of wobbliness that you get from affine texture warping on the PS1, but that'll be shown off later on. I just like the fact that as a very bare bones basic thing here, you can see how it starts to affect all the assets, especially like with the chur. When you're looking at the colors, you can see the color gradient here from like yellow to the darker yellow here as we go slightly to the corner of the chur or the edge of it. You can see it affecting the metal work, so we can see the gradient of the lighting from sort of that dark metallic gray to the light, and then it goes back again. So this is really cool, and this is one thing that I got online. What I ended up doing was I ended up having to go, and I think it was Gumtree, and buy this. And apparently I'm allowed to then use it and modify it and reship it. So it's very helpful, because I really wanted the dithering in the project. That was one thing I was missing out. So then, when we go and throw all of this together, what we get is the finished sort of look that I was after. I'm still kind of not so sure about the resolution. I might actually change it. But what we have here is a little bit more of a PS1 style look to everything, where things at range, depending on where they are, will kind of wobble and give that affine texture look. We've got the dithering here, which can be seen around the light and on the floor as it gradients out. We've got the wobbling from the affine looking textures here that we can see on this Dreamcast model that I made, but also on the other assets. And to go back over what I'd learned from the other video and what people had put in the comments, I've also turned off texture filtering on my actual textures here, which made them look a little bit more pixely. Plus, with everything else that I've talked about so far in the video, it makes everything look a lot better. Now, whereas I think this texture on the right here was a 256, this is a 128, and this is a 64. The 64 doesn't look too bad. The 128 seems to be the middle ground, but it looks really nice. And the 256 looks incredibly sharp. Now what I'm thinking of doing is, in future, adding an option in the menu of maybe tweaking between the two of them, so you can have sort of the almost like MS-DOS style look in terms of when I'm talking about differences in graphics for this specifically. I've been looking heavily at, as I said before, older PlayStation games. Tomb Raider, I was leaning heavily on that for a while. And there was another one that I'd looked at video-wise that had shown the difference between MS-DOS, the Saturn, and the PlayStation versions of Tomb Raider 1. And I thought, you know what, I can always add settings in here so we get this kind of like more refined look that's better than the PlayStation and better than the Saturn, but still kind of looks the same, so it's a little bit higher resolution. And that would be what I would call the DOS effect in terms of getting just a little bit higher resolution textures here. And then, of course, we go out, and I've made a new test area, and the new test area shows off some of this stuff in action. This is using Tomb Raider 2 assets, because I absolutely love Tomb Raider 2, and also Resident Evil. And then I've made a couple of my own assets. So here we've got Leon from Resi 2 as a base to work off. And you'll be able to see, as we move the camera here, his model sort of warps a little bit. We get an idea of the affine texture warping from that. This is something that I developed myself, and then somebody else had created the shader for it as well on YouTube, and I ended up doing a mixture of both of them and tweaking them a little bit. And as a result, we've got that kind of like crazy warping that you'd get at range on the materials. And that happens on some of the other stuff here as we get closer and closer and closer. The walls in the background and the floor are from Tomb Raider, and then the rest of the assets are mine that I'm creating slowly over time. So what we've got here is a real-time feed to the camera in the other area, because it's supposed to be a security game. We've got some emissive texture, which is just a flat emissive plane. Then we've got a couple of flashlights, a set of like files or a a file cabinet. We've got an emergency door release and a fire, like an emergency fire alarm button, and then we've got a intercom And these are all like textures that I've more or less sourced from either real life or online, and then created them with really, really basic models. These are all squares, and then I've just slapped the textures on them, and you can slowly see how they warp a little bit here as I'm getting closer to them. They're incredibly like low res, low detail textures. Really simple stuff, but it's really nice to kind of do this and it actually work. And then over here we've got a texture that I've sourced from real life again, and then put it on like a ceiling just as a test. You can see the texture slowly warps as we move around here, similar to the Ridge Racer video. And the floor actually does it as well. You can see the floor isn't straight, it kind of warps. And the same with the wall when we get really close to it. We've got this kind of texture warping that you would see on something, say, like Life Force Tanker. But maybe a little bit stronger. I might need to edit that slightly. But if we play the game from in here now, with all these unfiltered textures, what we get is that kind of PS1 look that I was going for, maybe a little bit lower resolution though, where we can see the actual environment has been affected by the post-process as well from the live feed on the camera. I thought the live feed on the camera might not be affected with it being a separate asset, but it's really cool how we can see that. We've got, like I said, some very basic planes that show off some like glow effects, which are really cool. We've still got the assets that we can pick up here and use. So we've got real-time lighting here, and then we've got other pickups and things that I'm slowly making, and it's just made everything a lot easier to develop. The idea was to get this to a point where I can develop the art style really fast, and as long as I have the sources to work from, I can then take the textures, slap them on box models and things, and away we go. Like here we can see the textures start warping a little bit as I'm close to the intercom here. The same with the fire escape button and the emergency door release. Same thing happens with the security monitor here, just not as much, and the control panel. And we look at the floor. The floor is kind of warping underneath us here as we move, and the same with the wall when we get close to it and move. It's really crazy. I want to see what this is like when I actually have a proper environment done with it, because it's going to be like an office environment. I want to see how it works, because if it's too trippy for the player, then I'll have to tweak it. But at the moment, it's not looking too bad. This is all still, I think, within the PS1's limitation, just running on Unreal Engine 4. The only difference, like I've said previously in other videos, is I wanted to get the real-time lighting and real-time shadows on this, just to be able to make it look a little bit more enhanced. The idea is that it's meant to be kind of like Sonic Mania was. It was like if you had a Sega game on a Saturn just running and looking a little bit better and more polished. This is like what it would be if you took the PlayStation and just applied all the polishing from most of the other games on the PlayStation to one game, and then just what it would look like from that. I'm really enjoying this. It's really fun to develop these assets. These were all developed over the course of, like, I think a couple of hours of me just sort of finding the reference image and then building them up, so it didn't take long. I'm really happy about it, because it means that in future, hopefully, I should be able to develop things really easy. Like I said, I'm still trying to stay within the PlayStation's limits of polygon count and textures, so it's going to be fun to see how this goes. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this follow-up video, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!